Welcome, and thank you for joining us at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston this morning. I'm Earl Dredge.
And I am Georgette Dredge. We have been members of the church for 38 years.
Dr. Bossen kicks off our focus on the second Unitarian Universalist source, the words and deeds of prophetic people, with the sermon titled, These Things Figuratively. He discusses Origen, the great North African theologian from the 3rd century. He taught that much of the Bible should be read metaphorically and was the earliest major proponent of universalism.
For those of you new to our congregation or our online services, I invite you to continue watching after the benediction to hear more about Unitarian Universalism. We now invite you to hear our call to worship.
Come, let us worship together. We come to worship, to give worth to that which is greater than ourselves, whether it be an ineffable spirit of life and love, or the responsibility of our community to transform with the power of love. We come to hear the words and learn of the deeds of prophetic women and men, both past and present, which challenge us to be our best and to do those tasks of our community. We know if we do not hear of the words and deeds of all peoples, history and our learning are incomplete. We come to look forward, to look ahead from the cusp of the Lunar New Year. We are reminded that opportunities to begin again, the opportunities to continue the work of our community, are ever renewing. We come to join together in fellowship and in love. Come, let us worship together.
Somos unitarios universalistas. Tenemos una mente para pensar, un corazón para amar y unas manos que están listas para servir a los demás.
Celebremos compartiendo nuestras vidas, encendiendo esta luz.
La caravana de amor, ven, otra vez ven, 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 cual eres, ven, nómada en búsqueda, si amas la vida, la nuestra es la caravana de amor, ven, otra vez ven. Cual eres, ven, nómada en búsqueda, si amas la vida, la nuestra es la caravana de amor, ven, otra vez ven.
Have you ever thought of our faith as a tree? Some people have. Today we will look at our faith as a tree of ancestors. It can be awe-inspiring to see all the roots and branches that make up the people and history of our religion. The roots of the tree are the values that we hold dear, like reason, tolerance, freedom, hope, faith, and love. These roots have brought forth many ancestors, carrying the values out into the world. Though they have passed before us, they are in our ancestral tree still, kept alive in memories, stories, and values they passed on to us. This is the trunk from which the tree gets its strength. It is what unites us in carrying out this legacy. Last month, our church started reflecting on the 6 sources of our Unitarian Universalist faith. And this month, we look at our second source, the words and actions of people who change the world for the better, to bring justice, compassion, and love to help all people thrive. Who are the ancestors who have supported our faith? I'll mention a few here. Origen, an important early scholar from the North African continent, who Reverend Colin will be talking about today. John Murray, a Universalist minister. Ethelred Brown, a Jamaican-born Unitarian minister. Louisa May Alcott, author of the book Little Women. You may have read this or will someday. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Olympia Brown, and Susan B. Anthony, who worked to get women the right to vote. We see now the branches of our tree, growing and changing to find the light, the multifaceted truth that we all seek, our connections to the community of Unitarian Universalists all over the world. And there are the leaves of the tree, the members of our church, First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston. There are many who are working to make the world a better place. There are teachers, scientists, nurses, therapists, writers, and more. There are people who lead various advocacy efforts to change racist policies, to reduce climate change, and to help support democracy. These leaves give life to the tree even after they have fallen, nourishing the roots of our tradition with the reality of its members' truth-seeking, compassionate, justice-demanding, nature-conscious faith. None of these ancestors or role models asks us to be exactly like them. Rather, their lives inspire us. They offer a place to start or continue our faith journeys. This tree includes each of you, not only our adults, but also our children and youth. With these roots, this trunk, these branches and leaves, with our values, with our ancestors, and our hard-working, truth-telling, everyday heroes, there you are. This tree cannot tell you how to grow. It can, however, give you hope, courage, sustenance, a place to look out and see the possibilities, and of course, a place to which you may always return home. May it be so.
Please join me in the spirit that some call prayer and others name meditation. On this first Sunday of Black History Month, I invite you to open yourself to the teaching, the wisdom, the love of those who have gone before and left the world a vision of the beloved community that might yet be. Take a breath. Take another. And imagine the prophetic wisdom of the ancestors, the ones who pointed the way, who taught that love is more powerful than hate, who created, who painted, who sang, who discovered medicines and laws of science, who brought healing, whose names we know and could list almost forever. Nina Simone, Adam Clayton Powell, George Washington Carver, Fred Hampton, Marcia P. Johnson, Martin King, Betty Shabazz, Alexander Dumas, Harriet Tubman, W.E.B. Du Bois, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Sojourner Truth, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Their names go on like the stars in the sky, bright beacons which we could never entirely recite, and accompanied by the names of so many who you and I shall never know. This Sunday, let us honor these ancestors and ask their presence be ever with us as we unite hearts and hands to build the world of justice that so many have dreamed about. That it might be so, I invite the congregation, absent in body but present in spirit, to say Amen. We now pause together to lift up that which sits heavy and light upon our hearts. We lift up John Cooper, uncle of Reverend Scott Cooper, and Anne Feeney, friend of the Bossen family, both of whom died earlier this week. I invite you to now say the name or bring to mind those you wish to be held by the loving embrace of this religious community. In this great cloud of witness and memory, amid this beloved community, we hear these names and hold them in our hearts. We pause in awe and wonder of the mystery that is life. In the spirit of love, in the spirit of hope, and in the spirit of compassion, I invite each of you to enter into a time of silent prayer, meditation, or reflection.
This morning, our offering will be shared with the Rutherford B.H. Yates Museum in Freedmanstown. Please enjoy this video describing the museum.
Lou Williams is proud of where she grew up.
It was a very good experience for a young person.
Lou grew up in Freedmanstown, built by a community of freed slaves and their descendants in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They built homes, churches, businesses, and even the roads.
African Americans put those bricks out there on Andrew Street, and they've been there over 100 years.
But sadly, Freedmanstown and the community that built it is in danger of being forgotten. The Rutherford B.H. Yates Museum was established to make sure that doesn't happen. Dr. Theophilus Harrington is the president of the Yates Museum.
What Yates Museum will do is to have a footprint around education, archaeology, research, and of course preservation. The Yates Museum has 10 properties, and on those properties we have 6 structures.
Including houses of special historical significance.
That's the house that was occupied by the first African-American lawyer, attorney in the Houston area.
His goal is clear.
That we can show people who were here and the kind of struggle that they went through to have a point of significance as a neighborhood and a community in Houston.
To preserve this community, the Yates Museum needs help from the larger Houston community.
So those 6 structures need some kind of maintenance or restoration.
Volunteers from the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston have been offering their time, energy, and money for over 15 years.
Who's been working diligently to bring those projects to stabilization, and one to near completion that we hope will have a soft opening sometime this year for. We are undertaking a capital fundraising campaign, and that campaign is going to be over, of course, some years. We will be able to preserve the property structures that we have.
When the houses are returned to their original glory, Theo and Luz see the museum as a symbol to show others what this community achieved.
We need to pass that on to our children and grandchildren or whatever.
Protecting it and passing it on.
Yeah.
Yeah, protecting it and passing it on.
Today, through our shared offering to the Yates Museum, we're helping to promote the preservation, education, archaeology, and research of African diaspora history in our region. So we ask you to give generously. An offering will now be gratefully received.
Our first reading is from On First Principles by Origen. But in order to learn the truth of what we say from the facts themselves, let us now examine the actual passages of Scripture. What man of intelligence, I ask, will consider it a reasonable statement that the first and the second and the third day, in which there are said to be both morning and evening, existed without sun and moon and stars, while the first day was even without a heaven? And who could be found so silly as to believe that God, after the manner of a farmer, planted trees in a paradise eastward in Eden, and set therein a tree of life, that is, a visible and palpable tree of wood, of such a sort that anyone who ate of this tree with bodily teeth would gain life, and again, that anyone who ate of another tree would get a knowledge of good and evil? And further, when God is said to walk in the paradise in the evening, and Adam to hide himself behind a tree, I do not think anyone will doubt that these statements are made by Scripture in a figurative manner, in order that through them certain mystical truths may be indicated.
Slave Ideology and Biblical Interpretation by Katie Geneva Cannon. The process that legitimated Christian slave apology was a reconstruction of history and divine action in it. It was claimed that God sent slavers to the wilds of Africa, a so-called depraved, savage, heathen world, in order to free Africans of ignorance, superstition, and corruption. It is of more than passing significance that pro-slavery writing portrayed Africa as the scene of unmitigated cannibalism, fetish worship, and licentiousness. Using gross caricatures, slave apologists mounted an ideological offensive in justification of the ravishing of the entire continent of Africa. They argued that Africans by nature were framed and designed for subjection and obedience. Their preoccupation was that people designated by nature as bestial slaves and heathens, were destined by providence for slavery.
This Sunday, we are starting two entwined sermon series. We're beginning a cycle on the second source of the Unitarian Universalist Association, Words and Deeds of Prophetic People, which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. And, since this is Black History Month, we are celebrating our second source with a series of sketches portraying the life and teachings of important Unitarian, Universalist, and Unitarian Universalist thinkers from Africa or the African diaspora. We begin with a figure who is not often thought of as African, the early Christian theologian Origen. He taught that the Christian New Testament and the Hebrew Bible should be read, in his words, in a figurative manner, so that the mystical truths within the text could be properly understood. He offered a vision of universal salvation that was sufficiently radical that the scholar Elaine Pagels has summarized it as envisioning animals, stars, and stones, as well as humans, demons, and angels sharing a common destiny. His theological generosity meant that centuries after his death, much of his teaching was branded as heretical. I'll get to Origen's life and teachings a little bit later in the sermon. But before I do, I want to suggest that Origen's Africanness is of primary importance. White supremacist culture erases Black history. Reconstructing Black history is a central task in deconstructing white supremacy. White supremacy tries to trick us into imagining the world in black and white. It is a two-dimensional vision which attempts to render much of blackness unseen or irrelevant. The path-breaking theologian Katie Cannon observed that the pattern of describing Africa as a, quote, so-called depraved, savage, heathen world was foundational to the creation of chattel slavery. This white supremacist portrait of Africa has been so false that it has required the bleaching of history and the transmutation of many of the foundational figures of the Christian tradition and what we might broadly call the Western canon. In the white supremacist imagination, African people have often been turned white so that they could be incorporated into the intellectual history of religion, philosophy, and theology without threatening the racist narrative that Africans and other people of color are somehow less than white people. There was a rather infamous instance of this a number of years back when the former Fox News host Megyn Kelly felt a need to state on air that both Jesus and Santa Claus were white. Since this is not the Christmas season, I will leave a discussion of Mr. Claus for a later time. Though when it gets to December, I do recommend that you take a listen to Akeem and Teddy Van's excellent soul classic, Santa Claus is a Black Man. As for Jesus, if he was a historical person, he was definitely not a European. He was a Jewish man who shared his ethnicity with the rest of the Judean population of the era. He probably had black hair, brown eyes, and dark olive skin. I had my own perception around all of this shocked when I first started studying theology in seminary. I took systematic theology with the Unitarian Universalist theologian Tandeka, who Reverend Scott will be talking with you about next week. Her course at Meadville Lombard was a year-long and somewhat legendary for its rigor. She did not suffer fools gladly and constantly challenged her students to clarify their thinking and improve their scholarship. She required us to back up our positions with citations from whatever text we were studying. It was never enough to say, well, such and such a theologian thought this or that. We had to be able to point to the page in whichever text we were reading and show that what and where the theologian had written whatever it was that we claimed that they had written. I learned to make statements like, well, on page 328 of G.W. Butterworth's translation of Origen's On First Principles, we find the statement, there will be a time when all things are restored and become one, and God shall be all in all. At the time, it seemed an exceptionally pedantic exercise, and I've never been sure how it really prepared me for the parish ministry, though I suspect that if you were in the sanctuary with me, we could have somehow turned my last paragraph into a laugh line. But it was excellent training for my doctoral studies and life as a scholar. It is suffice to say that such rigor did not appeal to all of my fellow students, and a few of them hated Tandeka's theology class. They thought it was irrelevant for however they imagined the career that they were preparing for. Her course was organized chronologically. Over the year, we moved from ancient thinkers like Origen to contemporary ones such as Laurel Hullman, then serving as the senior minister of the First Unitarian Church of Dallas. Near the start of the first quarter, I witnessed a conversation between Tandeka and another student that I will never forget. Now, I was not a participant in the exchange, just a witness to it, but it radically shifted the way I approach the world. You have ever had a classroom experience like that one? One in which the teacher disrupts, shakes, upends, or otherwise causes you to reconsider the way in which you understand the world? Well, that discussion was one of those. It began slightly before the seminar started. The student in question came into the room loudly complaining to one of their friends, "I'm so sick of studying all these old white men. I feel like they're the only people we study in this class." Even though the class had not started, Tandeka looked up from her notes at the student and said, "Excuse me, which old white men are you talking about?" We were reading Augustine's Confessions that week, so the student stated, "Well, Augustine, obviously, for one." Tandeka replied, "Did you read the text? Where did Augustine say he was from?" Hippo, I think, wherever that is, came the response. Hippo was in North Africa. It's in an area that's now called Algeria. Augustine was born there, and he was most definitely not European, or what we now call white. Who else do you object to as an old white man? Arius. Arius was an early Christian theologian who opposed the doctrine of the Trinity and who influenced the development of Unitarian Christianity. Nope, he was a North African, just like Augustine, came the retort. Tell me another one, Dante continued. By this time, I suspect that my fellow student anticipated that they had fallen into a trap of their own making. One by one, they listed the thinkers who he had been studying in the course. Each one of them, it turned out, was either from the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, or Turkey. Not a single one of them was an old white man, though with the notable exception of the Desert Mothers, early Christian ascetics about whom I've spoken with you before, they were all male. When the student, by that point greatly exasperated, reached the end of their list, Tandaica told them, "You should think about why you assumed that everyone we are reading in this course is white." And then she commenced the day's seminar without further comment and had us turn to our assigned reading. Origen was one of the figures in that list that my fellow students stumbled through. He was born in Alexandria in Egypt in about 184 Common Era. Egypt, it should be remembered, is part of Africa. Origen died around 253 in what is now Lebanon. During his roughly 70 years, he gained a reputation for piety and scholarship. He wrote as many as 2,000 texts, many of them homilies and most of them now lost, and is sometimes described as the greatest thinker of the early Christian era. His religious devotion was legendary. He is supposed to have come from a Christian family. When his father was executed by the Roman authorities for his Christian beliefs, it said that Origen so wanted to follow his father's example that his mother had to hide all of his clothes. Not wanting to go out of the house naked, he was not able to go to the authorities, confess his Christianity, and achieve the martyrdom he desired. Now, a lot of scholars doubt the accuracy of this story. It appears to have been fabricated by his admirers about 50 years after his death. Another story has him engaging in self-castration, taking the statement in Matthew, "There are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven," literally. I'm inclined to agree with those who also doubt the validity of this part of Origen's biography. He taught, after all, that sacred texts should not be read literally. At the age of 18, Origen was a catechist, a person entrusted with teaching others about the doctrine of the church in the great school of Alexandria. It was an institution that was at the center of early Christian intellectual life and produced several of the tradition's greatest ancient thinkers, almost all of whom, I might remark again, were of African origin. He was ordained sometime in his 30s, and shortly thereafter, it appears that he had some sort of dispute with the Bishop of Alexandria. The details aren't known, but it resulted in his expulsion from the school and his decision to travel to the city of Caesarea, in what is now Israel, to join the church and school of theology there. While in Caesarea, he compiled the Hexapla, one of the most comprehensive early critical editions of the Hebrew Bible. It contains 2 versions of the Hebrew text alongside 4 different Greek translations. The sermons he gave in Caesarea are said to have been so beautiful and his delivery so passionate that a contemporary witness described his preaching as like a spark falling in our deepest soul, setting it on fire, making it burst into flame within us. It's hard to imagine better praise for a preacher. At the end of his life, he was imprisoned and tortured during one of the Roman government's frequent persecutions of Christians. He was released after about a year and spent the last few years of his life suffering from the wounds he received while in prison. He died a revered teacher. Like many early Christian teachers, it's hard to know how much of his biography is fiction and how much of it mirrors the life he actually led. Whatever the case, it is certain that Origen was very faithful to his vision of Christianity. He described this vision most fully in his text on First Principles. Commonly regarded as the first effort to create a systematic Christian theology, it's a thick volume that set much of the standard for the ensuing genre. In it, Origen attempts to describe the genesis and purpose of the universe, the nature of the human soul, and the ultimate destiny of all things. On First Principles is rich and challenging. If you have the patience with that kind of thing, it's well worth the read. Exploring the text, you might be struck, as I have been, with the complexity of Origen's theology and the diversity of early Christian thought. Much of it bears little resemblance to the so-called Christian fundamentalism that dominates much of contemporary religion in the United States. Instead of rigidity, there's subtlety. Instead of an emphasis on human depravity, there is a trust in the fundamental goodness of the universe. Though the text is ancient, there are a number of theological teachings or spiritual positions in it that you might find inspiring. In what remains of this sermon, I want to lift up three, all of which connect with Unitarian Universalism today. The first is Origen's trust in the power of reason. The second is his faith in the goodness of the universe. And the third is his hope for universal salvation. You might notice my choice of language, the use of the words trust, faith, and hope, bespeaks a certain hesitancy or hedging on his part. This lack of verbal firmness is inspired by Origen's frequent use of his description of his text as an inquiry. He did not believe that he saw fully and definitively into the mind of God. Instead, he thought his text was an attempt to answer rational questions as best he could, while admitting that the divine is not comprehended by the mind of any created being. The word rational gets to the heart of Origen's understanding of humanity and the beauty of the world. He was a spiritually deep and prayerful man. He believed that the divine was best approached through reason and free inquiry. Indeed, he taught that human beings were created as rational, intelligent beings, blessed with free will. This meant that we could devote ourselves to the practice of the good, and we could be held to account when we act in the opposite way. Now, such an account might lead to a belief that God rewards the righteousness and punishes the sinful. But for Origen, it had another implication. He believed that the sinful and the righteous punish themselves by their choices, writing, "The soul has gathered within itself a multitude of its evil deeds and an abundance of its sins. At the requisite time, the whole mass of evil boils up into punishment and is kindled into penalties. The conscience is harassed and pricked by its own stings and becomes accuser and witness against itself." I find much truth in this observation. What about you? I have a sense of right and wrong, a moral code by which I attempt to live, and yet I am far, far from perfect. More often than I like to admit, I fail to live up to the expectations I set for myself. My expectations around parenting, friendship, the ministry, thoughts I have about what it means to work towards a better world or to live with truth. Now, this is not confession hour, so I'm going to spare you the details. But I will share that when I do something that I know is wrong or later discover was wrong, I find myself spending a sleepless night, worrying, having my conscience pricked by its own stings about what I have done and what I might do to try to make it right. Does that experience seem familiar to you? Origen would have us have faith. He thought that Jesus was the physician of our souls who could help us heal from such self-imposed torments. I appreciate him pointing to Jesus, the healer and the teacher. And I appreciate how this pointing was linked to his belief in both the goodness of the divine, the faith in the ultimate salvation of all being, and the possibility of goodness within each of us. He claimed that we were born, after all, rational and intelligent beings, and that this belief came from not a belief in original sin, but, to quote contemporary theologian Matthew Fox, original blessing. Our life's work, and possibly our afterlife's work as well, he's not particularly clear on this point, was to open ourselves, to cleanse ourselves of our own foolishness, to such an extent that we might be restored and become one when God shall be all in all. For some, this restoration, this recognition of the spark of the divine within each of us might happen all of a sudden. For others, it would occur during the lapse of infinite and immeasurable ages, seeing that the improvement and correction will be realized slowly and separately in each individual person. Given Origen's emphasis on reading the Hebrew Bible and Christian New Testament figuratively, I admit I am uncertain whether to interpret him literally or metaphorically. Did he mean that this was a process that would happen in the eons that stretched out after we died? Or occur in our lifetimes during those restless nights that seem to stretch into infinitude when we stare at the ceiling or stare at our pillows, lost in tumultuous thoughts? Or perhaps he thought that it would occur in some mix of the two. Whatever the case, he believed that even to the last enemy, all beings shared a common fate and a common destiny, and was imbued with the blessing of the divine. It is said by some that Origen's reference to the last enemy was meant to include even Satan in his account of universal salvation. Now, there's debate on this point, and I'm not an Origen scholar, so I can only observe that such a faith requires a belief in the radical goodness of the divine. It is a belief that God so loved the world that when she birthed it with the intention that all things would be reunited with the divine in the end. Universalists of the 19th and 20th century imagined this as the gospel of God's success. The late Gordon McKeeman said, picturesquely spoken, the image was that of the last unrepentant sinner being dragged screaming and kicking into heaven, unable to resist the power and love of the Almighty. It is an expression of the belief foundational to many contemporary Unitarian Universalist theologies of the transformative power of love, of the radical strength of love, of the hope, the faith, and in the end, whatever the end is, the belief that love will prove stronger than hate. I bridge Origen to McKeeman to remind us of the two principal points of this sermon. First, the Unitarian Universalist tradition is connected to the most ancient of Christian beliefs, beliefs obscured by much of what is now called Christianity, the belief in the power of the goodness and the faith in the common destiny of all. And second, the lesson that Tendaica would have had my fellow students and I take away, in part from her class, that so many of the thinkers who we Unitarian Universalists look to for inspiration, that so many of those who we owe debts to, who offer the foundations of not only our theologies, but the philosophy and theologies of all of this society, were African. This Black History Month, I encourage you to not only celebrate Black history with those who are widely known, the history of Harriet Tubman and Nina Simone, but also the history that white supremacists have tried to bleach from the world, the Black history of Augustine, Arius, and Origen, and so many others. That it might be so, I say amen and blessed be.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
We end our service with an invocation of the faith of Origen. May our own faith in the possibility of the universe's goodness be like his, sufficient to hope that in the end, even the last enemy shall be united in our common destiny. Go in peace, go in love. May our lives be a blessing. Amen.
Please join me in thanking Roland Reiss, our business administrator, and Alex Kimmick, our family ministry coordinator, for participating in today's service. The Estrada family lit the chalice this morning, and Christian Holmes helped Carol Burris present the big idea. Mark Vogel, our music director, conducted the sanctuary choir, and James Westfall from our Thoreau campus provided additional music on the piano.
For those of you who may be new to this congregation or the online services, let us say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. Unitarian Universalism is a faith where you can bring your whole self, your full identity, your questioning mind, your expansive heart. As Unitarian Universalists, we join together on a journey that honors everywhere we've been before. Together, we create a force more powerful than one person or one belief system. Our beliefs are diverse and inclusive. Rather than a creed, we share a covenant based on a set of 7 principles. These include the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and the knowledge that we are part of an interconnected web of all existence that calls us to honor the earth and all creatures. Thank you for being with us today.
While our church as buildings is closed, our church as people is still meeting, but now online. There are weekly and monthly offerings to keep you connected and engaged with our community. Join us this morning at 11:30 for the coffee half hour to chat with new and old friends. Then join the discussion circle at noon for a discussion about power in relationships. The creative writing group meets today at 2. The group welcomes a full range of artistic expression from the traditional to the experimental. Join the Wednesday evening discussions for fun, facilitated, and educational conversations on a variety of topics. This week, Eric will lead a conversation asking, how does racism impact how we assess people? Do you have questions about becoming a part of a thriving progressive faith community? Come to Membership 101 Thursday at 6 to get more information about joining the church. Many of the topics for upcoming discussion groups are on our website, firstuuhouston.org/online-group-meetings. Visit there for more details and to sign up. And remember, all times shown are Central Standard Time.